goes to.
And the Oscar goes to.
And the Oscar goes to.
Every year, only one movie makes it out. In a year where thousands of feature-length films are released, they whittle them down to 10 and in prior years even 5 films. From those handful of films, then there's only one Best Picture that gets picked every year. Yet, despite all that selection, they get it wrong. We end up looking back on a given Best Picture lineup and go, well, how did this not win? Or they must be high to think that this is better than this. It's an ongoing discussion about what the Academy deems worthy of Best Picture for that year, as the landscape of film changes year by year. That said, we're not going to talk about that. Rather than talking about what ought to win or what should win, what we find more fascinating is what gets in. What are the few films so deemed to be nominated over all the great films of that year? In the history of the Academy Awards, the winner may get thrown around flippantly or for some ulterior reason that contradicts where the film world is going. Yet, there usually is a banger every year in the lineup. You get at least one, or in the case of more recent years given the category expansion, 2 fantastic films that without question are deserved in the lineup. Many videos have been made about the best years in film. These years are marveled as containing the greatest range of films, or have a stacked upper echelon of incredible films, or have that great mix of artistically significant greats and mainstream appealing classics. With this video, we aim to look at the best years in Oscars history. We want to know what the best lineup of Best Picture nominees look like. What was the year where the Academy presented an embarrassment of riches for what they deem the best films of that given year? Now, while this exercise is incredibly subjective as all art is, and feels like a futile gesture to quote-unquote rank art against each other, the Academy does it anyway, and it's fun to do rank videos, so yeah, we're gonna do it anyway. For this video, we have recorded all of our data using the websites Letterboxd and IMDb. Why those two? For starters, we just like these websites more, truthfully. We like the broader appeal IMDb has and the younger niche appeal that attracts users to Letterboxd. While both websites have their own audiences that generally rate movies on a consistent basis, IMDb skews older and more millennial with their taste, and Letterboxd skews younger and more Gen Z with theirs. By pulling from both of them, we don't get too flooded with data and have a more harmonious sense on what the public views as the best films of the year, with a slight bias towards Letterboxd, as they have shown they take more care in preserving a better understanding of what constitutes a quote-unquote great film. So, the data in question. Basically, we took the score of each Best Picture nominee across history. Then, for a given year, we took the averages of those nominees for Letterboxd and IMDb. Once we got those averages, we ranked them against the other years. Then, we got a cumulative ranking for both websites and arrived at our conclusion. Numbers! Fun! At the same time, we took the scores and listed what the public views as the actual best picture for that year, and threw in some other stuff like what the overall best film of that given year was, and our quote-unquote staff pick for what was the best picture for that year.
Get on with it!
Yes, get on with it!
A lot of talking, a lot of explaining, so let's start at the bottom. Here's the worst Best Picture lineup of all time. Number 97, 1928 to 1929. Not the first year of the Oscars, but the second comes in dead last as having the absolute worst lineup. 1928 to 1929 fields a lineup of 5 movies, including The Patriot, not the Mel Gibson one, which didn't even have a score on both websites. Perhaps the overall score could be chalked up to the obscurity of these picks. However, that point is rendered moot, as this was the same year The Passion of Joan of Arc came out, a film that has garnered legendary status over the years despite being released almost a century ago. You will also notice how our staff pick is not listed. We found that there were years where we either did not watch any of the films or determined that there was no real winner in that year. So apologies for not doing our homework as much. Still, one could draw that unlike the technical achievements of films like the prior winner Wings was, these films just lacked the kind of ingenuity and flair that modern critics need out of films from this time period. This was also the time right before a lot of the great masters started presenting their great works. Frank Capra, John Ford, Billy Wilder, Alfred Hitchcock, and others that would make the golden age of Hollywood come together in the 40s were too young or just starting out during this time period and were still honing their craft. Ultimately, it's a dud year and one that we're just gonna move on from. Number 96, 1930 to 1931. A slightly better lineup, but still quite underwhelming. 1930 to 1931 boasted another unfortunate lineup of films, right in the midst of the Great Depression. Still no sight of any of the old masters. While it looks like the front page is a solid movie, it feels like a lot of nothing on this list. Unfortunately, it's also another year where we didn't see anything. Sorry. Number 95, 1934. Okay, here we go, here's something. This year bears the distinction of being headlined by It Happened One Night, the first real great Frank Capra film. Unfortunately, the year gets dragged down by the volume of films and their lack of quality. While you have movies like The Gay Divorcee, I believe they meant it as Happy, and The Thin Man, with the sequel being The Fat Man of course, most of the lineup leaves much to be desired. Another trend I noticed when looking at the lineups of the 30s is that you had the original versions of a lot of films of the postmodern iterations that we know today, especially films that we perceive as being the original. For example, this Cleopatra is not to be confused with the 60s Cleopatra that supposedly ushered in the new Hollywood era. All in all, a pretty lame year. At least they picked the best film of the lineup and the year as a whole. Number 94, 1932 to 1933. Holy shit, more years from the 30s. And again, nothing that we've seen. Highlight of the year is I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, long ass title, which is a movie I've never heard of, unfortunately. Also, the first Little Women movie. Well, actually it's the first sound adaptation. Again, it's interesting how far the history of film spans, even if we're talking less than 150 years. Plus, it shows just how often we've remade things and made IP-driven material. Moving on. Number 93, 1929 to 1930. God damn it, let me leave the 30s! Certified banger, All Quiet on the Western Front, again not to be confused with the new one, gets bogged down by more of the mediocre Oscar picks like Disraeli. Is The Divorcee the prequel to The Gay Divorcee? Is there a straight divorcee that they made later on? Will there be a modern remake called The Bi Divorcee or The Poly Divorcee? Am I stretching this bit out too long because I have nothing to say about this Oscar year? Yes! Number 92, 1936. A tiny bit more modern now, but still talking about the 30s. Now we're really deep into the Great Depression, and the film still expressed the sense of grandeur and magnificence that the public wanted. That sense of escapism could only go so far once you got out of the Depression, but for now it seemed to work. Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times not being included in this is odd given how he was the biggest star in the world. However, maybe his leanings towards satire and social commentary were too strong for the time and they didn't want to highlight that work. Not much else to comment on, I'm really getting tired of the 30s here. Number 91, 1955. Yay, a reprieve! We leave the 30s and entered one of my favorite decades in film history, the 50s. As much as the time period is known for societal repression and Cold War fear, there was always at least one all-time classic released somewhere in the world every year. Carl Theodor Dreyer's Ordet would be this year's best film. However, much like in the many years to follow, the lack of access to foreign films and the general American disinterest in them led to many of the greats not being recognized until years later. But given the lineup at this time, maybe they should have. Another year of mid at least contains an okay film like Mr. Roberts. While the film may border on truly being considered a great one, the film's star-studded cast and solid comedic performances make it a good time for those watching. Unfortunately, it's still a pretty mediocre Oscar lineup, especially as we're still in the bottom 10. Number 90, 1931 to 1932. Back in the 30s again? Fine. Any good movies? Sure. Have I seen any of them? Nope. Have I heard of any of them? Negative. What's the best movie of the year? Trouble in Paradise. No clue about that one. Number 89, 1963. Smell the roses, kids. It's the 60s. While we're nowhere near the start of the new Hollywood movement, we're definitely in the color era. A lot of big movies with a capital B in the lineup here. Cleopatra is obviously the headliner here, as the film became the scapegoat of the Hollywood trend of producing bigger and bigger films that became too big to successfully turn a profit. While not a bad film at all, it does suffer from melodrama being too over the top. How the West Was Won became our pick for this year, as we found the smaller stories paired with the grandness of Cinerama and the direction of John Ford made for a good experience. It's just such a shame that Akira Kurosawa's best film High and Low didn't make the lineup here, but again, it's the 60s. Number 88, 1952. A truly mixed bag lineup. Somehow, The Greatest Show on Earth won over the John Ford directed The Quiet Man and High F***ing Noon. It goes to show that, much like how Scorsese lost out for so many years, it's never a lock that the Academy will recognize the best director's film that year. As much as The Quiet Man serves as one of Ford's later standout films, High Noon is the real winner out of the bunch here. A very dramatic and well-structured film, High Noon presents a moral and realistic struggle that Gary Cooper must face as the town's sheriff, a great tale of good versus evil that does so while dancing around the gray for the entire movie. It also features some great performances by Cooper, Grace Kelly, and others. A great western not directed by John Ford, and probably the best movie of this year if Ikiru weren't made. Number 87, 1935. Back to the 30s, and we are, once again, met with a collection of films that don't really contribute to the overall film canon. Perhaps that's part of this greater conversation. Perhaps, in the moment, these films felt like the biggest things in the world and were as important as how the great modern films feel. However, that's the case with all great art. The common saying of great art going underappreciated in its time rings true when talking about many great films that were box office bombs or just generally misunderstood. With the films here, perhaps Ruggles of Red Gap needs a fresh coat of paint and to be exhibited to the world. Until we see it, we can't make that claim. Sorry. Number 86, 1927 to 1928. The first year of the entire ceremony. Obviously, it has that great historical significance. However, only 3 films being included leaves us with a really small pool to talk about. Wings is the obvious standout, not just because it won, but because it's one of the standouts from a technical aspect. Still, no Metropolis and no films that we've seen. Sorry again. Number 85, 1970. Yay, stuff we know! Patton leads us into the 70s, a decade marked by some of the greatest films of all time, and a wave of auteur-driven directors that shaped the Hollywood we know today. Looking at the lineup, however, and it doesn't necessarily scream excellent quality. Looking deeper though, there's much more here. Besides Love Story, you can talk about all 5 of these films. Airport is the standout of the disaster movie wave that occurred during this time, with its culmination coming 4 years later with Towering Inferno, and its eventual spoof coming with Airplane. 5 Easy Pieces was one of the first great films starring Jack Nicholson. It is also noteworthy as being one of the standout films produced by BVS Productions. BVS Productions, formed by Bert Schneider, Bob Rafelson, and Stephen Blauner, was probably the premier film production company making alternative and counterculture films. From their history with the Monkees to their films, BVS Productions had their fingers on the pulse of what was cool and hip. Their films included Head, Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces, Drive, he said, The Last Picture Show, A Safe Place, and The King of Marvin Gardens. They mostly starred Jack Nicholson and were realistic dramas about young people dealing with societal and introspective problems. On another note, MASH became a big signifier of the culture at the time, as the film used the Korean War as a vehicle to make a black comedy about the ongoing Vietnam War. MASH's brand of asynchronistic and biting comedy was perfect for a 1970 audience that had grown disgusted with the ongoing war and launched the career of director Robert Altman as one of the prevailing American directors in the 70s and 80s. Plus, it became a TV show. Lastly, Patton was a combination of a character analysis and a war epic. It's no surprise a film of such scale and subtext was written by Francis Ford Coppola, a script that got him Best Screenplay and more clout for him to make The Godfather. It's probably the George C. Scott performance, but we're also fond of Exorcist 3 over here. Honestly, a solid lineup, all things considered, that makes it feel like we're finally out of the rough years for the Oscars. We'll see. Number 84, 1937. Our first tie, as both 1937 and 1954 had identical average scores, but 1954 had a slightly better number 1 movie, so 37 gets slotted here. We're still in the 30s, but we at least have Lost Horizon as a film we recognize. A bit of a divisive movie over here, as our staff thinks it's Oscar worthy due to the scale and intriguing story. I just think it's kind of dull and has a lot of mediocre and bordering on bad performances. You also have the original A Star Is Born, so there's that. Again, apologies, we haven't seen a lot of films from this period. Number 83, 1954. Here we go. On the Waterfront carries a lineup of potentially forgettable films. The Caine Mutiny does get the nod from our staff here, as it features some great performances in a cool setting. Much has been said about On the Waterfront and its subtext when juxtaposed with McCarthyism and the famous Hollywood blacklist.
And having sold all of his people to McCarthy, he then made a film called On the Waterfront, which was a celebration of The Informer.
However, Marlon Brando still delivers one of his best performances and solidifies himself as one of the best in the game. Once again, another year where Hollywood finds themselves in transition. We're nowhere near New Hollywood, but we're a few years outside the golden age now, and this general hangover of popular cinema in the 50s really shows in a year like this. While on the other side of the world you have 7 f***ing samurai being made, we're left with 3 coins in the fountain, whatever that movie is. Number 82, 1985. Quentin Tarantino has made his claim over the years that the 80s was a bad decade for movies. While the popular films became pop culture staples for multiple generations, he remarks that the films didn't take enough chances and played for mass audiences rather than going for something real and true. 1985 is a perfect encapsulation of that mentality. There are obviously some good movies here. Witness has a good Harrison Ford performance. Kiss of the Spider Woman is a good one. Of course, The Color Purple had good performances and was one of the first good quote-unquote serious Steven Spielberg movies. Yet the winner, being Out of Africa, really presents this image of a Hollywood obsessed with leading performances and image rather than interesting and encapsulating stories. It's unfortunate that in years such as this, your highlighted Best Picture nominees were this forgettable instead of cool genre movies like Back to the Future or great foreign films like Come and See and Mishima, Life in 4 Chapters. Hell, The Breakfast Club not being nominated in this bunch really makes you question what the voters were thinking at the time. Number 81, 1956. The big films with a capital B have arrived. As the television became more accessible to families, Hollywood movies became bigger and bigger in order to lure people out of their homes. While dramas like Giants still existed, The Ten Commandments and The Winner Around the World in 80 Days are prime examples of the kind of bombastic epics that would later blow up in years to come. Biblical tales aside, Ten Commandments is just a damn good movie. Epic in scale and performances, the film delivers on such a rich text and premise. Perhaps the effects look dated by today's standards, however the music and wide lenses really do a good job in presenting such grand action that you can't help but get entangled in the story. A great movie in an okay lineup. Number 80, 1938. Just like that, we're back to the 30s, but there's some good stuff here. A bloated year that still features 10 nominees, you have highlights like Grand Illusion and The Adventures of Robin Hood. While Grand Illusion didn't work for me personally, Robin Hood is just a good ass time. Errol Flynn running around, making people look silly and getting into all sorts of fun action is a good recipe for a good watch. As far as being one of the top movies of the year goes, that's where you kind of want more sizzle to your steak. Number 79, 1944. The same year the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy is the same year as Double Indemnity, one of the great noir films in an era full of great ones. Great writing, great performances, and great atmosphere, Double Indemnity delivers on multiple levels. A great film, and one that we haven't seen. Sorry. Number 78, 2021. Ooh, our first year from this century and this decade. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic wreaked havoc on the world and all businesses. As everyone shut down, so did Hollywood and their productions. While 2020 could have been the year that really felt the shutdown, there were enough films already in post-production at that time that just needed to be edited and polished for award season. 2021, however, included all the films mid-production in 2020 that needed to be finished once things opened up. Plus, you had a lot of studios withholding their biggest projects for the next year in fear that people weren't ready for the theatrical experience yet. So, what films did you have? Some forgettable films in here include Don't Look Up and Nightmare Alley. King Richard became infamous as the film that got Will Smith to the award show, and, well, you know the rest. Belfast and The Power of the Dog were well received at the time, but seem to have slipped out of the public consciousness. West Side Story had its moment and is considered a great achievement by Spielberg and company. It's unfortunate about all the Ansel Elgort stuff though. We liked Licorice Pizza a lot here, but maybe not enough to put it as one of the best films of the year. Basically, you had a top 3 of Coda, Drive My Car, and Dune. A solid top 3 all things considered, but those films get dragged down by a lot of the mid on this list. As much as Dune 1 didn't win, a man can dream that Dune Part 2 still has a chance. A man can dream. Number 77, 1942. A lot of solid movies with nothing really standing out aside from the Magnificent Ambersons. Don't really have much to say about this one, sorry. Number 76, 1988. The Rain Man year. As much as the film is the perfect encapsulation of the kind of 80s Oscar bait type of movie, it's still a good movie with some good performances. In this field of nominees, it's basically Rain Man and Working Girl as far as a clear winner is concerned. Here are a few other movies that didn't get included in the top 5 here. My Neighbor Totoro, Die Hard, Akira, Cinema Paradiso, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, They Live, and The Last Temptation of Christ. Any of those could have easily won this year in my eyes. Them not being included is really nothing new for this time, as the Academy has never really liked genre movies or foreign films, especially animated ones. Half Glass Full, it's nice to think about how far we've come when something like Parasite won Best Picture a few years ago. Number 75, 1960. The Apartment! Billy Wilder's masterpiece reigns over all. The start of the 60s begins with the arguably best director of the 50s making his best movie. All sorts of twists and turns are cooked into a fantastic script that is elevated by the nuanced performances on screen. It's one of those movies that you gotta watch once you start getting into black and white movies. That said, the rest of the field leaves much to be desired. It's another year where you have that one stellar movie and a field of okay stuff. Remember The Alamo? Nah. Number 74, 2011. A lot of the burgeoning online discussion of this time pointed to this year as one of the worst Oscar years of recent memory. While it has since been eclipsed by 2021, 2011 has a very quote-unquote standard feel, especially compared to some of the other years. Hollywood hasn't been swept up in superhero movies yet, nor have we seen the wave of 2010's auteurs that brought a lot of the fresh voices we know today. So, you have some of the old guard, Spielberg for War Horse, Scorsese for Hugo, Woody Allen for Midnight in Paris, Malick for The Tree of Life, and a lot of the directors who haven't really capitalized on anything since this point. Extremely Loud and War Horse are serviceable. The Descendants, Hugo, The Artist, The Help, and Midnight all seem like the same kind of Oscar bait dramas that do an okay job. The Tree of Life not winning is pretty lame considering all that movie is going for and the names attached to it. Then there's Moneyball. Basically, the people's choice for Oscar, Moneyball is a sweet movie that works for everyone. I am not a baseball fan by any means. but the script is tight and the pacing is so mannered and realistic that it makes you fall in love with all the characters. It's great that a movie like this was included in the Best Picture conversation, however, in a more loaded year, it's definitely getting bounced out. Not that bad of a year, all things considered, but it doesn't really have any standouts, unlike in years previously discussed. Number 73, 1958. Exactly the same conversation as what we had for 2011. 1958's winner Gigi tanks the overall rating in a year of okay to good movies. How did fucking Vertigo not make it on here? A great Jimmy Stewart performance, incredible visuals, great editing? Fuck, that's a layup! Come on, man! Number 72, 1943. The last year of having 10 nominees for the Oscars until 2008, it's the Casablanca year. While you have the Oxbow incident and some other potential picks here, there's no denying Casablanca as the #1 movie of the year. Its scale, the acting, the precision at which the story is told, and the timing of its release all work in the movie's favor. While I'm not the biggest fan of the movie, the middle's just a bit too slow for me, I can't deny the greatness of Casablanca. It's one of those classic Hollywood movies that has a legacy built over decades of top 10 lists and critics coming together to sing the praises of this film. Number 71, 1951. An okay year, all things considered. The eventual winner, An American in Paris, is another by-the-books 50s movie that relies on the good performances and has that rose-tinted glasses feel to it. A Streetcar Named Desire, on the other hand, is the kind of rough story that has received a lot of praise over the years. While a bit overly theatrical at times, it's the first really awesome Brando performance that would lead to On the Waterfront and his rocket ship to stardom and elite status. It's another year that is characterized by its slight diminition in quality, especially when compared to its 40s predecessors, and especially with all the burgeoning international cinema happening. Number 70, 1953. Still in the 50s here, we have 1953. I've heard good things about Roman Holiday. Our staff here went with From Here to Eternity. You've also got Shane, which is supposed to be good. I'm starting to get really tired with all these years where I can't talk about anything. Moving on. Number 69, 1966. Something to talk about. 1966 features one of the best dramas of the decade in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. An actor's movie, sure, but undeniable performances and a solid script really bolster this movie above the rest. That said, The Russians Are Coming is apparently a funny movie from this time that works, so our crew went with this pick. If anyone's curious, this is also the year of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and it's basically the year before all the new Hollywood stuff starts happening. It really shows how short-sighted a lot of the Academy voters were at the time, given what was bubbling up under the surface. Number 68, 1983. 1983 may actually be one of the more underrated Oscar years on this list. As much as Tender Mercies and The Dresser are movies, it's Terms of Endearment, The Big Chill, and The Right Stuff. We're not talking about A Space Odyssey or anything like that, but these are all good to great level movies with great casts and some great performances. Our crew really likes Terms and how great the performances are. I've never seen Right Stuff, so I can't go to bat for that. However, Big Chill is one of those underrated classics that I would love to see back in circulation. A great ensemble cast with some really biting dark humor. It doesn't go for anything flashy, and it stays in the same location. However, the pacing and how the story unravels allows the audience to really feel for each of the characters, no matter how annoying or off-putting they feel at first. It's a prime example of the same thing Goodfellas and Boogie Nights do, where you have characters in funny situations or saying funny things, and then give them emotional moments. We get hooked by the funny and resonate with the emotion. So yeah, The Big Chill, check it out. Number 67, 1987. Similar to 1988, 1987 has a good collection of films contending for Best Picture. However, the neglecting of some of these classics really make you question The Last Emperor as the #1 movie of this year. Full Metal Jacket, The Princess Bride, Evil Dead 2, Hellraiser, RoboCop, Raising Arizona, The Untouchables, and Wings of Desire could all be slotted in this group for a variety of reasons. Even lesser quality movies that are still iconic like Lethal Weapon, Predator, and Dirty Dancing feel out of the mix here. Perhaps this is the reason why the Oscars ended up going back to the 10-movie format, yet Hope and Glory is really the only one that you'd take out if you were doing it all over again. Fatal Attraction was a very popular movie at the time and remains one of the gold standards for the sex thriller. The Last Emperor is probably Bernardo Bertolucci's best endeavor next to The Conformist, and is regarded as still being the best movie of the year. For our money though, it comes down to Broadcast News and Moonstruck. Like with The Big Chill, Broadcast and Moonstruck are dramatic comedies or dramedies that make for a very enjoyable watch, despite having very emotional scenes. Moonstruck may dip into the ridiculous a bit too much, but that's part of its appeal. The Nick Cage performance, Cher bringing it, all the supporting cast, it's a great rom-com as the rom-com genre really started to populate. Broadcast News, however, leads us into a very sobering tale about TV news and all the problems in it. For something that could be seen as mundane or too specific for broad audiences, the Holly Hunter performance really gives the movie the heart it needs. 1987, not a bad year all things considered. Number 66, 1941. One of the greatest movies of all time, a movie that changed filmmaking forever, a movie mired in controversy, and a historic movie for the ages, Citizen Kane, which didn't win this year. It isn't a bad year because of that decision, nor did Kane lose to some suck movie. How Green Was My Valley was another great John Ford movie during the peak of his powers. You also had a bunch of other really solid picks here. Suspicion, another classic Hitchcock movie, Sergeant York, one of those movies you hear about but forget to watch, and The Maltese Falcon, an iconic movie but not my favorite Bogart movie, lead a pretty solid collection of movies. It's just that it's the same year that Citizen Kane came out, and that other movies like Blossoms in the Dust and One Foot in Heaven kind of drag the whole year down. As we get further on in these rankings, you see just how many seemingly unremarkable movies can be thrown in together with some of these all-time classics. Plus you have cases like the previous year discussed in 1987, where you had a bunch of movies we remember far more than the perceived best ofs by the Academy. The excuse with Kane could be the whole great art is rarely appreciated in its time mantra, however the politics of the film and its drawings on real-life figures seemingly made it difficult for Academy voters to really give it the nod that it deserved. But we talk about Citizen Kane all these years later, so it works out that way. Number 65, 1965. Epic movies! Wow! Hey kids, do you like singing? The Sound of Music leads a field of forgettable movies and Dr. Zhivago. Unfortunately, only my team has seen both of these movies. For whatever reason, they go with Zhivago, the movie with a week's worth of running time, over the statistical and Academy favorite. Whatever, I guess. As much as this time period is marred by the Cleopatras of the world, you can see the appeal of bombastic movies like Sound of Music and how, when a movie like that works, it really works. Number 64, 2005. Ooh, the stinky year. 2005 features the most lopsided contest between what movie won Best Picture and what should have won. Crash is an ultimately forgettable movie that harbors a lot of seemingly dated politics, masquerading as this super meaningful and important movie. Brokeback Mountain, on the other hand, was a fixture in pop culture and is recognized as one of the great game movies of all time. It's probably Ang Lee's best movie and has one of Heath Ledger's defining performances. Whether it was the politics of the Academy at the time or not, Crash won out. At the same time, it's not like there were any other really great movies that year. Munich is a standout Spielberg movie, but maybe not one of his best? Capote's got Hoffman, and Good Night and Good Luck is there. For 2005 as a whole, it shares similarities with 2006 as just being a kind of down year across Hollywood. Sure, you got Harry Potter, the first Nolan Batman movie, and Revenge of the Sith, but that's it. A lot of sleeper hits and Pride and Prejudice. Ultimately, it was Brokeback's year and it should have won. Number 63, 1947. It's Miracle on 34th Street and the rest. Great Expectations is good. It's a lot of just good things on this list. The year is basically the median of Oscar years. Miracle is one of the most quintessential Christmas movies of all time and probably the best one out of this list. Another year from the 40s we don't know much about. Number 62, 1968. The year after the boundary pushing and reinvigorating lineup of 1967, we get to 1968 and it's like nothing even happened. A lot of your standard Hollywood dramas and dramedies fill up a lineup that so desperately needs 2001: A Space Odyssey. It is insane that 2001, Once Upon a Time in the West, Rosemary's Baby, and Night of the Living Dead all came out this year and none of them made the cut. The Lion in Winter looks like the statistically best movie here, but such a shame they didn't go with any of the aforementioned picks here, especially as the landscape of Hollywood is changing right in front of them. Number 61, 1940. All things considered, 1940 is a kind of stacked year. The eventual winner, Rebecca, is one of Hitchcock's best during that pre-50s part of his career. If not for The Great Dictator, it would probably be the best movie on here. Speaking of, The Great Dictator is probably the most controversial of all films here. Despite being Chaplin's last great film, it is his most political and came out at a time when we really didn't know what the mustache guy was up to. The satire really works when combined with Chaplin's great performance. Then you've got The Philadelphia Story, one of the great rom-coms of all time, with an all-star trio of Katharine Hepburn, Cary Grant, and the GOAT, Jimmy Stewart. The Grapes of Wrath is seen as John Ford's best non-Western film. However, I'm a bit sour on it as the performances really didn't work on me and the story kind of dragged. All in all, a kind of loaded year. Number 60, 1978. The year after Star Wars, we get the year of The Deer Hunter. Michael Cimino's best movie and one of Robert De Niro's greatest performances, Deer Hunter conveys a harsh story about the Vietnam veteran in a way that is both grounded but cinematic. Incredibly dramatic, yes, but the middle of the movie really serves to make us care about De Niro's and Walken's characters so that the climax can really work. As much as the 70s is a decade known for its deep and gritty movies, 1978 really feels like a response to the success of the blockbusters in years past. You got Grease, Superman, Jaws 2, and a lot of pop movies rather than Deer Hunter types. Basically, Deer Hunter runs away with the year. Go check it out if you haven't seen it yet. Number 59, 1977. Hey, speaking of Star Wars, here it is! If you didn't know already, Star Wars was the blockbuster film, and spawned a lot of the stuff we experience today. As much as it could seem like it was a travesty that didn't win Best Picture, Annie Hall was a real touchstone for a lot of people. That snappy New York talk mixed with the romantic touch really made for a good mix of a movie. Woody Allen aside, Annie Hall was a standout movie of the 70s and made a bridge between the slightly obscure New Yorker filmmakers like John Cassavetes and that whole scene to the mainstream. Despite being rom-coms, Annie Hall, Manhattan, and a lot of the early Woody Allen movies were proxy art house films that burrow themselves into the mainstream and the public accepted them. On another note, The Goodbye Girl is a solid pick that should be highlighted. Off the heels of Jaws and Close Encounters, Richard Dreyfuss stars with Marsha Mason in a rom-com with a lot of heart. It's another slice of life that plays on the sensibilities of the Academy at the time, but damn it, it does it so well. You go, Richard Dreyfuss, you help that single mother and her daughter out. In the end, any year is a great year when Star Wars is in the lineup. Number 58, 1967. The year it all changed. As we discussed in this video, it was a really rough decade, especially as the French New Wave took over the indie culture of film and other waves of international cinema continued. Kurosawa, Ozu, and others dominated in the East, and Japanese horror really came in a big way. Little bits of African and Middle Eastern cinema were starting to percolate, yet American cinema felt stale and out of time. That all changed in 1967. Dr. Dolittle drags the whole lineup down, as every movie in this list is a classic in some regard. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is the more forgotten of the Sidney Poitier classics, but is a force of nature. You get Poitier, Katharine Hepburn, and Spencer Tracy just eviscerating the screen with their acting chops. In its totality, it's the Sidney Poitier year. This, and In the Heat of the Night, established Sidney as this generation's Marlon Brando, the best actor in the world doing the most interesting films. Heat of the Night deservedly won given the context and the passionate performances from Poitier and company. That said, it can be argued that Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate have left a larger mark on filmmaking as a whole. Bonnie and Clyde's violence and marriage of violence with sex had repercussions that we still feel today as we have moved towards more illicit material and directors have found their voice using similar themes. The Graduate became a classic for its introspection into one loser kind of character and had an iconic soundtrack, which served as a blueprint for how films would use pop music in the later years. This is not to diminish the quality of Heat of the Night, nor is it to make all these films compete against each other retroactively, but it does speak to the high bar of quality in this year. Except for Dr. Dolittle, of course. Number 57, 1945. Brief Encounter was robbed of getting a nomination. We've never seen The Lost Weekend or Mildred Peace. We apologize. Number 56, 2018. Ooh, a bit of a spicy year, huh? Green Book became instantly hated, as many wrote about its seemingly childish view on race relations and presented a worldview that some audiences believed we have evolved out of. Haven't seen it, so I can't really comment on it. For as much as many filmgoers bemoaned picks like Vice and Bohemian Rhapsody as being Oscar bait, you've got interesting choices like Yorgos Lanthimos' The Favorite and Alfonso Cuarón's Roma. Spike Lee rose to prominence with BlacKkKlansman, A Star is Born definitely had its fans, and then, probably the most controversial inclusion here, Black Panther. The first MCU movie in Best Picture contention, Black Panther presented its case off the back of its beautiful set designing, costumes, and good performances. While the CGI had its moments of being less than stellar, the sheer scope and grandeur of the film put it up there with the big musicals of the past, like West Side Story for example. In our book, Black Panther could get the nod, but it doesn't move us to the level of putting it as a true Oscar-winning movie, given the sloppy CGI at times and the lame portrayal of T'Challa. That said, you can make the argument for at least 3 here, and I think you'd be satisfied. The real winner, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, was unfortunately left out of the group here. That's the real Marvel movie that should have been in contention, at least in our opinion. Number 55, 1986. Oh shit, wrong clip. It's the Platoon year. Not only was it one of the bigger movies of the year from a pop culture perspective, but it was a critical darling that explored the stories of a platoon entangled in the Vietnam War. We don't talk much about Oliver Stone's filmography as someone who had a definite voice and who was able to spread himself and deliver across a variety of genres. Between Platoon, Wall Street, and JFK, it's tough to narrow down what exactly is his peak movie. Outside of Platoon, Hannah and Her Sisters was the insert good Woody Allen movie that had to be thrown in there. Good performances of course, but it seemingly has slipped out of the public consciousness given it's Woody, and it's not one of his masterpieces in the late 70s. Still good though. The rest of the 86 lineup, I got no clue. I'm sure all your parents know A Room with a View and those movies. Out of my element on these. Number 54, 1989. Ah, movies I know! Yes, we love Morgan Freeman. Yes, Driving Miss Daisy was a cultural touchstone for a brief period of time and was certainly a beloved movie at that time. But Come on, Dead Poets Society is the clear winner here. Robin Williams brings it in his greatest performance next to Good Will Hunting, and has a script full of twists and nuances that are delivered with a great and young ensemble cast. Quick shout out to Howard Feurer, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who nailed it with the casting of all the young guys here. It's not like The Outsiders where it's an all-star cast before they became all-stars, but there's enough future star value and everyone just fits right with what they're trying to portray here. No one's really hamming it up, which is difficult to pull off given how young these guys are. The subject matter gets so darkly serious, and you feel like everyone in this movie is so human and real. Given all that, Dead Poets wasn't the only banger here. My Left Foot and Born on the 4th of July are both carried by incredible lead performances in Daniel Day-Lewis and Tom Cruise respectively. Outside of Risky Business, this is the first version of Serious Cruise we'd see, and your mileage may vary on the performance depending on how you see his makeup. Still, another good Vietnam movie by Oliver Stone. I've never seen My Left Foot, but I've heard good things about Daniel Day in it. Then you've got the feel-good movie in Field of Dreams. As cheesy as a baseball movie about ghosts can be, Field works because of the earnestness at which it is delivered and Kevin Costner's lead performance. A movie like this could be so corny and dated, but it goes to show how a great lead and a star-studded cast can carry what would be a wild premise. A good year where the wrong movie won. Number 53, 1981. A good year where the wrong movie won. Chariots of Fire is a meme at this point. I have never seen it, but it's always been the one where the guys run on the beach. I'm sure it's good, but come on. Peak Harrison Ford, peak Steven Spielberg, George Lucas producing, peak John Williams, it's Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm sure there was some pop culture bias with the Academy here, as they didn't want to sully themselves by picking an action-adventure movie. However, you could just look at the images and see the level of craft involved here. It's not the most complex story in the world, but we remember all the iconic moments here for a reason. Spielberg's mastery of spectacle direction is only aided by his ability to carry out dialogue and transitional scenes. The moments in Raiders are made ever so better by Spielberg's pacing and handling of giving information to the audience. As simple as these things sound, it doesn't work for many action directors, but much like his hero John Ford, Spielberg presents his John Wayne as best he can and moves the audience along in an enjoyable ride. What probably didn't help the film's case was its lack of real, let's call it, acting moments. It's not to say Harrison Ford isn't a great actor, it's to say that Raiders lacked those big monologue scenes or long dialogues that worked for the Academy at this time. What ended up winning during this time were these dramas that were about one or two characters and included a lot of dialogue. Raiders isn't ordinary people, for example, and it's a shame that the Academy seemingly had a very narrow view at what makes for the best movie of the year. Number 52, 2008. The year before they expanded back to 10 picks, 2008 came off the heels of one of the greatest movie years of all time, 2007. In a field that desperately needed The Dark Knight, you had a few political dramas in Milk and Frost Nixon. You had The Reader, okay. You had one of the weaker David Fincher films in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Finally, you had Slumdog Millionaire. It's all fine. There really isn't that for sure number one like in other years. Slumdog's good, it sets up Dev Patel to do all the cool shit he'd do later on, but like I said, it's an Oscar lineup that feels empty without the biggest movie of the year and the movie featuring the best performance of the year. You can't think of film in 2008 without thinking of The Dark Knight, and it feels weird not having it on here. Yeah, it's a Batman movie. Yeah, it's a comic book movie, but it's probably the best comic book movie of all time, and it's the peak for so many who worked on it. So yes, I'm the millionth guy on the internet to talk about The Dark Knight. Christopher Nolan, you have my soul.
Kendrick! Drop another diss track, and my life is yours!
Number 51, 1991. Silence of the fucking Lambs, dude! Bugsy, get the fuck out of here! The Prince of Tides, more like the Prince of Losers! The Silence of the Lambs is one of the greatest movies of the 90s. It's the best movie of the year by a country mile, and we still talk about it to this day. You can't ask much more out of a thriller like this. performances, nuances, pacing, structure, cinematography. You've got everything in Silence. At the same token, this is also the year of Beauty and the Beast and JFK, one of the pillars of the 90s revival of Disney animation and one of Oliver Stone's trademark movies presented stiff competition for Silence. It is at this point where we're really seeing the lineup start to rise in quality and popularity. You've got to remember that movies were still a big part of the zeitgeist at this time. To have a Disney movie and a JFK conspiracy movie and a crazy thriller movie about a cannibal in your lineup is such a wild thing to do. We talk a lot about when the Academy gets things wrong. This is absolutely a year where they got it right. To have the pull to present The Silence of the Lambs as Best Picture and executed on it is so refreshing, especially given the Academy's history.
Continued in part 2.